So what's cooler than a monkey riding a chicken? Why, a stormtrooper riding a lizard, Star Wars style, of course. This kit is part of the Star Wars Legion tabletop game. It's officially called the Dewback Rider Unit Expansion, and it's a fairly simple kit. Comes with 4 parts that make up the Dewback, and then there's a couple of accessories that go on it. There are 4 figure options that allow you to build 2 figures that can go onto the model. The legs are actually molded onto the model, and you're just putting on the upper torso. So potentially, if you wanted to, you could come up with any of these options you want. In fact, I imagine if you magnetized them, you could come up with all of them. The parts are very nicely cast. You can see here, like on this forward part of the Dewback's body, the nice texture on the skin, the Stormtrooper's legs cast in here, the detail on the saddle bags, I guess you would call them. It's got the fur that's on the back of the beast. The head is cast in 2 parts, which is actually quite nice because it allows you to easily paint the inside of the mouth without having any difficulty reaching that. And when you put the 2 parts together, I've test fitted this, when you put the two parts together, then and slide it in here, there's really no seam line. It looks really good. I wanted to start off painting the mouth. I started with the Centaur skin from Army Painter. It proved to be a very thin paint and took quite a few layers to get that built up, but it did build up into the color I wanted. I painted the tongue that color too, even though I planned to paint it this Warlock purple also from Army Painter. I just wanted that good base under there so I wasn't having to fight the gray that had been under there before. But once those were painted, I wanted to give it a wash of Reikland Flesh Shade from Citadel, and I just washed this all over. I didn't worry about trying to be precise or neat. I let it gather in the recesses and just really shaded it down. Now for the teeth, I used this deck tan. I figured that lizards in the Empire didn't have the best dental hygiene plan as part of their contract, so I went with a fairly dingy color for the teeth. And then once I had that on there, I gave it a wash of Agrax Earthshade just around the teeth and in the recesses in the teeth, the dimples, I guess you'd say, just to help darken those down a bit and make them look, it's a big lizard, to make it look like dirty teeth. And then I took some of the deck tan after that had dried, and I brightened up the edges just a bit to bring it back a little so that it didn't look quite so dingy. And then for the bit in his mouth, I gave it this coat of Citadel Lead Belcher, and I just applied that directly on there. I didn't worry about doing any kind of other metallic colors or anything like that. And then I just used some more Agrax Earthshade to bring out the edge. And I thought the mouth turned out pretty good. It looks like a lizard mouth to me, which was the goal in the whole thing, and it gives a nice spot of color. Now, as a basis for the skin, I wanted to use this Strachan green from Citadel. Now, even though the sides and the top are going to be painted with darker greens, I wanted to base everything in this green, again, just so that I had a nice base to put paint down over and didn't have to fight the gray. I'd already have some green there. Around the mouth, I was careful to leave just a little bit of his lizard lips showing, just to kind of highlight the mouth because I thought that was a cool feature. The next color would be the Citadel's Deathworld Forest, which was going to be applied along the sides, starting down near the feet and working up almost to the top of the back. Now I started off with a very thin paint so that there could be a little bit of a transition between the 2 colors. I wasn't going for a true gradient. I was okay if there was a little bit of a sharper demarcation, but I did want there to be some transparency down at the beginning of where it was applied. And then once that dried and I had the areas covered that I wanted, I went back in and applied another coat or two just to make it a little more opaque further up the sides of the dewback, to give it a more of a green appearance and less of a glazed appearance. Now the next color is this Castellan green, and I used the same process. I started off with it fairly thin and just let that apply right along the edge of the demarcation between the medium color and the darker color, and then went back later and made it a little more opaque so it got better coverage. Now the next thing I wanted to do was apply some tan color, so I used these Castellan green, the Mournfang brown, and a little bit of Iraqi sand, and thinned that down with some Agrax Earthshade and water. Because if you examine some of the photos of the original Dewback, there's a very famous photo, and if you do some color corrections in it, you'll see that there are some tannish kind of stripes or splotches. Now they could be dust, they could be stripes, I wasn't sure, but I wanted to make sure to replicate those on the model. So again, using a very thin paint, I just applied those on there so that it would give hints of some kind of color change on there. Now right here, it looks a little bit stark. It turned out like I wanted, and when I compared it to the photos, I thought it looked good, but right here, it looks a little stark. But I did a 1-to-1 mix of Coelia green shade and Agrax earth shade, and then mixed it down with just a little bit of Lamian medium to give it some a little bit of thinness, I guess you'd say. And I just applied this over the whole model. Now, I wasn't trying to do a proper wash in terms of bringing out details, and in some ways it was a glaze. I guess you'd call it a glaze wash. I was okay if it settled in the recesses, but what I was wanting it to do was unify the green tones and just make it look a little more lizard-like. Once I had that in place, I started with this base of Mournfang brown for the hair on the top. Now, I've never seen a hairy lizard, but I thought that this would make a nice distinction between the hair and the skin. I didn't want it to be too subtle. I wanted it to stand out a little bit. And then once I had the Mournfang brown on, I knew I could add a shade and later highlights to help that stand out a little more. I went ahead and put on some Rhinox hide to begin basing the leather areas. This is a good color for basing your leather. It's not the only color. Really what you're looking for when you're basing leather is just a dark brownish color with a hint of red to it. That starts off as a good base for leather. And this Rhinox hide is perfect for that, although there are plenty of other, like I said, there's plenty of other colors. But now I've got a good basis that I can start the leather with the highlighting and the shading. I wanted to add some hints of distressing on the leather area, so I started with this Doom Bull brown, and I heavily thinned it down and just began to stipple it on around the leather strap parts. I wasn't going for full coverage, just a distressed look, and I applied this in multiple layers so that there was more color up on the higher surfaces, the upturned surfaces, than along the belly, so that it kind of gave it a little bit of a gradient effect, but just made the leather appear worn and old. And then I went to this saddle brown, and I wanted a little different look on the saddlebags. So I did the same stippling motion across those with the saddle brown, again, just to give it a worn look. Tuscarora fur was the final color that I did on the straps. And this was to not only provide an edge highlight, but I also did some markings on it that were more like you would do with chipping, again, just to make the leather appear distressed and worn and cracked and old from use and from being out in the sun and things like that. A mix of saddle brown and Iraqi sand was used on the saddles to achieve the same effect, just to make it look a little worn and old and just kind of cracked up a bit. Then I put a coat of Agrax Earthshade on the straps, and this would just unify the colors together, blend them together, and give it a final look of, hopefully, of some worn and beat up leather on those straps. For the saddlebags, I wanted a different look, so I used this Nasdrag yellow contrast paint. And this would just give them a lighter look, like they were maybe a different material or some kind of different, made of a different way, something like that. Just a little bit of visual interest so they didn't all look the same. And then I used this saddle brown to apply some highlights to his lizard fur. The solid brown color, even though I had put a wash on it, still looked a little flat. So a few highlights were added. And then a mix of Iraqi sand and saddle brown was used to bring out just even a few more highlights. I just painted a few tufts of hair for this, not all of them, just to make those stand out a bit. I also wanted to do some highlighting on the skin, so I went back to the Strachan green and just began painting the edges of some of the scales, not all of them. There would be too many to do it across the entire model, but I just painted a few of them to give it a little more of appearance, to give it of depth, of light reflecting off of those perhaps, and just make it look a little more interesting. The toenails were done with Vallejo black gray, and then I put neutral gray over them, and then a highlight of sky gray just right on the edge. These are going to get some, I guess you'd say, weathering later on, some earth effects, so I wasn't too worried about getting these looking very precise. I used some Fire Dragon Bright from Citadel for the eyes, and this color I thought looked pretty close to what I'd seen in the photos online of the Dewback from the original Star Wars movie. Now, I meant to show painting the black dot and a smaller white reflective dot, but I forgot to turn on the camera. So this is how the eye turned out, and I was pretty happy with how it turned out. I normally am not happy with how I paint eyes, but I thought this one turned out pretty well. So he's got his orange lizard eyes there. Now for painting the armor on the Stormtrooper, I used this sky gray, and what this was first it was a coating that would cover up all of the other paint that got onto the armor, but it would also provide kind of a shadow coat. I based everything in this, even if it wasn't going to be in the white armor, just to have a consistent coating that everything would go over. Now for the black areas, I painted them with this basalt gray, just the larger black areas, to give them a basing that I would later put a darker coat of contrast paint over. But again, this is just kind of covering up the lighter paint and any other paint that got on these areas. Now for the wash in the armor, I started with this apothecary white, 3 parts apothecary white, 1 part black Templar, and then I mixed that 50-50 with this contrast medium. And I just washed that all over the armor of the Stormtrooper and got it into all the nooks and crannies and cracks and crevices, and then just would dry off my brush and go back and wick up the wash off of any of the flatter parts of the armor. I just wanted it to settle in to the recesses mostly. But it made it really quick to do this. This was a technique that I saw Mark Sarastro doing, and I really liked how it turned out. I've used this several times on clone troopers, so I really liked this method. Then once I had that on there, and I also painted it onto the legs. I made sure to not get it onto the green areas, but this also went onto the legs. But then once I had that painted on there, I used a 50-50 mix of cold white and sky gray to start bringing back the armor, just to get it closer to white. Still wasn't going to pure white, but just going to those areas that were the flatter areas. And I avoided the area where the wash had settled in, and I used that mix to bring it up to a near white color. And then I used the cold white to paint the brightest highlights across all of the armor, on the helmet, the chest, the legs, the arms, just all of that, to provide just some gradients of color and maybe make it a little more like the shiny Stormtrooper armor. The black areas received a coat of Citadel's Black Templar contrast paint, just to darken those down. And then for the orange shoulder piece, I used the Life Color Rust Light Shadow 1 and just kind of painted that in, making sure to leave a little bit of the black showing on the outer rim, just to mimic what I saw in the photos that I found in my research online. I like the look of this orange shoulder pad. I just think it looks pretty cool. It looks very Stormtrooper-ish. On the backpack and other details that were black, I just used neutral gray to paint in some highlights, some details, just to give a little bit of contrast. And I also used this neutral gray to provide some chipping on the armor, making it look like it was beat up and used a little bit and had been in combat and that kind of thing. Next, I wanted to do a very simple base, so I started off using this Wilder Dark Russian Textured Earth. Now, this is an acrylic product that just goes on in a very chunky fashion. It's got actual chunks of, I don't know if it's dirt or something else, but it's a pretty chunky acrylic product. And then I just sprinkled some sand from my backyard. This was some that I'd sifted and cleaned up and just sprinkled it on there with the acrylic product still wet. And then I just flipped it over and cleaned it off, just knocked it off like that. And then I used a toothpick to draw in the firing arcs, just the outer edge of them, so that if somebody uses this for gaming, they'll have that in there. Then I thinned down some Iraqi sand paint and just used that very thin paint to paint over the base and give it a good sand color. And I wanted it to look like Tatooine, and so I needed this color for that. And then I dry brushed the same color over it. It knocked off a little bit of the sand, but I thought it just picked up some of the highlights and made it look a little bit varied. And then once I'd finished the dry brushing, I used some Citadel Agrax Earthshade to just draw in where those firing arcs are. And then I painted the rim of the base with Rhinox hide. I thought that would be a cool look. I usually use black, but I thought Rhinox hide would look really nice. I also used the Iraqi sand to dry brush on some dust and dirt around the feet and lower body of the lizard, and also on the Stormtrooper's legs, just to give it a dusty look. Well, I think I'm going to call this model done. I really like these Fantasy Flight Games Star Wars Legion kits, and this one has been one of the best. It's just, who would have known that painting a lizard could be so fun? I've really enjoyed this. Now, if you're wondering why I didn't do more to integrate the Dewback into the base to kind of squish it into the sand, I don't know if the person that's going to buy this will want to display it with the base or not. If they play the game, they may want to rebase it. If they don't play the game, they may not care to use the base. They may just want to display it on its own. So I just figured leaving it unglued would give more options for the buyer. I did complete the other figure also. So anyone who has this can swap out which rider is on it and have a different look there. So whether it's for gaming purposes or just display purposes, they get to pick which rider they want and kind of customize that look. Well, thank you so much for watching this video, especially if you're still watching it at this point. In fact, if you're still watching at this point, just drop a comment below that just says, "Here, lizard, 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 lizard." If you may remember, there was a cross promotion between Taco Bell and the Godzilla movie that came out many, many years ago, like in the late 90s. And the little Taco Bell dog was put out some tacos and said, "Here, lizard, 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 lizard." So yeah, you can put that down there and people will wonder what the heck you're talking about. But I'll know and I'll appreciate it. So thank you so much for watching. If you've not already done so, please hit the subscribe button down over here to subscribe to this channel, and click the little bell icon so you'll know when I get new videos published. And I'd be most grateful if you would drop a comment down below and just leave this video a like. That'll help me grow the channel, and I would be very grateful for that. There are links down below to Patreon, and there's also a join button over here if you'd like to support me either through Patreon or here on YouTube. And I would be most grateful for your support. It's what makes this channel keep going. And if you're already a supporter, thank you so much. I am grateful. My family and I are grateful. It makes what I do possible. So thank you very much for that. And as I always like to do, I'll leave you with one final thought. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye. Boom-ba-dee-da, 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 boom-ba. Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling until then.